Good morning. My name is Jason Sills. I am the Department Chair for Ethnic Studies. It is a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. It is our last event for Black History Month. Clap it up. As I stated before at our previous events, Black History Month is really a celebration, opportunity for reflection and learning, and we've had 6 events this month that have been wonderful. I feel like they've really began to emphasize what we've been trying to do is really focus on the Black family, and really trying to capture not just what's been going on with the Black family historically, but also shed some light in terms of learning and development. And so today we will continue that. And I just want to give thanks to all the people that have helped to contribute to making this month very successful, our faculty, our staff, our administration. There's been so many people that's been supportive, and so I want to give thanks to those people, and thanks for you all for coming out, because today we're going to talk about what I would consider to be a very important topic. I think the topic that we're dealing with today is one that is often spoke of, but in a different type of way. And so the title of this workshop or lecture is called Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children. And it actually comes from a book that was written by Dr. Amos Wilson in 1992. How many folks have heard of Dr. Amos Wilson by show of hands? A few people, good. And as you know, he was a psychologist, a social worker, an advocate. He worked inside of universities, colleges, detention centers. He was well versed, and he spent a lot of time studying. And so today, part of what we're doing is going to use some of his work, but other research as well. And so for you all that are here in class, I would say take some notes. If you have a smartphone, be smart, take pictures. It's fine. I think that it's important to have this conversation now, more so than ever. And when I think about what's happening around us in terms of what's happening in the media, right? What do we see around Black children in media? What do we see inside of schools? What's happening inside of our local schools, right? There's a book by Monique Morris called The Pushout. Show of hands, folks have read The Pushout or seen the book The Pushout? It's a really important text because it begins to talk about how there are some systemic issues happening inside of our schools that are pushing our young girls out. And it doesn't just look at the infrastructure, but it look at what are some of the practices, right? What's happening with instructors? What's happening with faculty? What's happening with the administration? Because there's a growing number of young girls that are being suspended at alarming rates. And so this topic is really important because I think sometimes with the reporting of what's happening with young Black children and adolescents, the reporting suggests that folks are criminal, folks are deviant, and so we have to take a different type of approach and look at what's happening internally, what's happening externally, but also shift our narrative. And so I want to make sure that as we do this, we have an opportunity to kind of look at what is this. So I think it's always important to kind of be mindful of the terminology, right? And so the title says Black. I've heard students in my classes ask questions, why do we use Black? Black is a political term in the sense of understanding the cultural roots of African that also begins to connect all African people throughout the world. We know historically folks have been removed from the continent, and so the slave ship stopped in various places. So we use the word Black as a way to kind of suggest a connection, understanding the movement towards liberation, and a solidarity. We use the word African to begin to talk about continental Africans, African American folks born here. And I'm just highlighting this information because we use these words interchangeable, but they actually have different meanings. They have different meanings. And so when we talk about Black children, I want to say that we're encompassing all Black children. And a lot of the time that I spent over the last, 19 years here in Oakland and in New York, San Francisco, Richmond, Vallejo. The work that I've done has been with black children throughout the diaspora. And there are some cultural things that are the same, and the results are the same in terms of treatment. You know, when we look at discrimination, when we look at narratives, people don't tend to discriminate based on what racial group you're from if you're a part of a collective. And so the differentiation doesn't tend to create a different type of experience, but the collective is important to understanding who is this group that we're referring to. So when I say the why, I think it's important to highlight the humanity of African children. Oftentimes when I'm listening and observing what's happening in the world, I'm often very mindful of how people are speaking about black children. What is the language? What is the verbiage? And I think about the countless boys and girls that have been suspended or the ones that have been murdered. I often hear people talking about them as though they're not human. And so for me, part of this discussion is to uplift the humanity, right? I don't know if you all know, but there's all different type of lectures and discussions around how to work with black children, how to support black children. And part of that is important. I want to acknowledge that part of it is helpful for people to understand what are the needs culturally of a group. But I think the other part that happens is that sometimes we talk about folks as though they are alien, as that they're so different than other children. And so I think it's important that we uplift the humanity, just to say that this is a group of children that deserve what all other children are getting access to. All children deserve safe, loving, nurturing environments in the home, in schools, and in communities. We also have to debunk some of the lies, some of the myths. How many folks, by a show of hands, have heard of the bell curve? Anybody ever heard of their teacher grading on the curve? Anybody want the teacher to grade on the curve? The idea of the bell curve actually comes from a political scientist. And some of the suggestions he was making is that people are innately wired in a way where whatever knowledge their group has, that's what they're born with. And what's problematic about that is that no one is innately born with a learning capacity. There are environmental factors that begin to support learning and development. And so what the bell hook suggests is that black children were innately inferior in terms of academics because of environmental factors, economic factors. And when people read that text, they actually believed it. And they saw it as science. And it was basically his perception. He was over at Stanford last week because he wrote a new book. And so there's a lot of people that support some of the things that he was saying, and it was only debunked or challenged when there were other scholars that said this is not based in science, that this is not based in research, that these are some claims based on your perception versus what is truly out there. And beginning to unpack, if people are in harmful situations, begin to unpack why are those situations there? Instead of just saying this is what the issue is, let's look at why the issue persists. And then let's provide an alternate perspective. You know, when I think about what I wanted to do with this, I really wanted to say that we should think about how we engage our children differently. And because I've worked in education for so long, I've been at, Hoover, I've been at Marcus A. Foster before it was shut down, I've been at McClymonds, Tech, Castlemont. And so I've seen boys of color, girls of color, black children for so long, and I've watched them be celebrated in certain instances, and I've seen them be pushed out. And so it's important to offer a different narrative, because I believe if you're an educator or if you're a person that believes in education, that you have to come in knowing who you are as a person. And what I mean by that is you need to know what your values are. Like, what are the things that are at the forefront of what informs how you speak about somebody, how you see somebody. Why is that important? Because your values also inform what? Your thoughts and your behaviors. We should always be mindful of what is our bias. Everybody has bias, just so we're all clear. Bias is favorable or unfavorable thoughts. Everybody has them. In knowing that, we should do some assessment of ourselves. Figure out who we are as people before we go out and begin to work with children and work with families. Whether you work in mental health, whether you work in education, it's important to figure out, what do I think about that group? If you watch the media, we know there are images that come out that aren't so positive. In your subconscious, you might develop negative thoughts. I always ask people, just begin to question certain things, like, have you ever walked down the street and saw somebody of African ancestry and you crossed the street? Have you ever saw somebody and feared them? Have you ever saw somebody and it was during school hours and you just walked by them without asking, why aren't you in school? Have you just walked by and not even acknowledged somebody? I think that a lot of what I'm trying to uplift is that how we're socialized also informs how we engage with people. How do we view people? And so for me, the why is significant. I think this is the most important piece. For me, I want to look at the assets. We should really begin to have a different lens when it comes to black children. The assets. What are the assets? Because oftentimes we actually deal with black and brown children from a deficit standpoint, that they are lacking. So when teachers, educators, sometimes administrators, coaches, these people that are in their lives, if they truly want to be able to support, they should look at them from what do they bring to the table, not what are they lacking. And so for me, in the years that I've worked with black children, I've seen these things show up consistently. I think that children in healthy environments are happy. It actually makes me sad when I see young children and they're not smiling. They're not happy. So for me, when I think about the creative expression, caring, family-oriented relationship, these are all things that I've seen and I can attest to because of my years of work. But this also are strategies. How do we begin to engage young people? How do we work with them and support them? So when we talk about awakening the genius, that means that there's already something there. And what does it depend on? It depends on the people. Who are the folks in those children's lives? It depends on the environment. What is the environment like? Is it an urban community? Is it a metropolitan? Is it the country? What's happening in the home? What's happening in the school? What's the school culture? What's happening in the classroom? Then you got to think about what is their perception? What is a young person's perception? One of the most beautiful things is when a child is very, very young. When they're very, very young, almost everything about them is in this explorative, like a very explorative mode. They're trying to figure out things, learn about themselves, learn about the world. And so usually they pick up everything and put it where? In their mouths. That's how they begin to gauge what is. But it's also the people that are around them that supports that. Supports healthy and safe exploration. That supports learning. It's how that child is loved on. When that child is very, very young, as early as 1, when they begin to take those first steps, it's important that as they are trying to balance themselves, that they get what? Positive affirmation. That there's some clapping. There's some celebration. Those things are really important. And so if these things are to come about, it's because of the people, the environment, the perception. And so when I'm looking at these things, it lets me know how far we can go. It lets me know what I can utilize. I hear a lot of teachers in classrooms saying, I don't know what to do. I've had an instructor on this campus come to me and say, how do I work with black children? And I ask them, what are you doing in your class? What is your curriculum? What is your teaching style? Are you mindful of their learning styles? Do you recognize that all students learn differently? But you have to start off knowing that students can be successful. So for me, when we talk about awakening, one, we know it's already there. The awakening process is engaging what is there. Engaging what is there. And then actually figuring out what is the destination, what is the goal, what is the objective. So when I think about it, in terms of education, I'm very, very clear that education for black children is more than just being successful in terms of being able to get a job. But that tends to be the focus. We send children to school and we talk about gaining skills. We talk about preparing yourself for college, preparing yourself for a career. And I think when we do that, we are setting them up for failure. Because for black children, education is political. For black children, education is about survival. Education is about knowing how do you create a lifestyle for yourself to be able to navigate a world that has you as the enemy in certain environments. So getting a job is not enough. Having skills is not enough. And this isn't just my words. If you look at some of the, we look at some of the people that have done some of this work, right? You say W. Du Bois once argued that the proper education for oppressed groups such as African Americans had special and critical purpose. He knew that education was always and everywhere political. Politics is about quality of life. When people say, I don't like politics, I'm always taken aback because politics is essentially folks meeting in rooms making decisions about your quality of life. So this is suggesting that education is always about quality of life. Quality of life. This is why when students come into my classroom, I always ask my students, folks that are in here that are my students, they will tell you always, why are you in this classroom? And typically students say stuff like, this fulfills a requirement, I want to get a good grade, and those things are good, but at the end of the day, I always tell them, shift your frame, shift your perspective. If you come to my class and you say, I want to learn how to be my best self, I want to take this information to grow me, you will get an A. Because you're going to try to come into that classroom and figure out what is best for you. You're going to be trying to figure out, how do I utilize this information rather than memorize this information so you can get a good grade. It's a very different process. But we're often taught the end result. I can't wait till I graduate. I can't wait till I get to college. So oftentimes the process is missing. We're not enjoying the middle phase. And so when I look at this, I'm knowing that for black children, there must be a different level of intent. It said the major function of education helps secure survival of a people. This is Amos Wilson. The survival of a people. What he's suggesting is that it's not about you. That as a black child going to school, typically it's about the community. That it's not about your journey. That when you go to a class and you're investing, that your investment is going to actually support a number of people. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this is your journey. It's a we, it's a collective. Education should prepare students both for economic roles in society and for their social, intellectual, and spiritual enhancement. So 2 roles, economic role and then enhancement, socially, intellectually, spiritually. This is important. This means that instructors need to ensure that curriculum is what? Life relevant. That is relevant to when folks walk out those doors, that they can use it every day. Sometimes when instructors teach, they teach in a way where they're going to give information which is helpful, but if that information isn't going to help you move through your everyday life, how helpful is it? If you can't use it in your community with community dynamics, how helpful is it? And it's not just in the social sciences. I would argue this needs to be in every field. Like if someone's teaching algebra, they should make sure that the algebra problems that are being shown are relevant to in the community. If you're doing chemistry, it should be something that's relevant to your community. You can teach chemistry by baking. It's the same exact thing. Somebody could learn how to bake a cake and chemistry at the same time. It might take the instructors more time in terms of preparation. But you have to make it relevant, because if you're just talking about pouring baking soda into a beaker, unless you're cooking something, unless you're making something that you're going to use, it's not relevant, because no kid is at home right now with beakers just putting stuff in, unless they're making a bomb, which I hope is not happening. So, right, we hope that's not happening. So it's not relevant. So then what happens? So then at a very early age, students begin to learn what? How to memorize random things so they can get a grade. So it's important that the instructors spend time creating information that is helpful. So then we have to back up. Because for me, this is where some of how our schools right now are set up have hindered our students. So Brown versus the Board of Education, for some people, was like monumental. They felt like it was a really great thing that we were integrating schools. And I think integration has its pluses, has its minuses. What I'll offer is just this piece. When a lot of those children were being integrated, they were being integrated in spaces where they weren't seen, where they weren't appreciated. And the greatest thing that they lost were those black teachers that truly believed in them, that saw that every student in this classroom has to get it, that we can't leave you behind, because they understood that every student was instrumental in what? The survival. So when you integrated schools, you put those children in environments where in some cases those teachers didn't value those students. Now, if we fast forward, we don't know that to be the case, that all instructors don't value our students. But what we do know is one of those things that's often not present is a level of love and a level of belief that those students are going to do well. And the understanding that it's about their survival. It is not about a job. It is not about a career. It's about the whole person. The development emotionally, spiritually, the development of skills, engaging people. Education should make you feel good about yourself. Very simple. Education should make you feel good about yourself. One of the things that I pride myself on in terms of being an educator is that when students come to my class, they often feel good about themselves because of what they've learned as it relates to their existence. That's primary. Because now they understand their value as it relates to the content, not just content. Now they have a different relationship with the class. So now they want to come in because they're getting something around their esteem, whether it's self-esteem or whether it's race esteem, understanding their pride, having a different self-concept. Those things provide a level of motivation that actually permeates outside of my class. That's the environmental piece that I'm talking about. So education, in terms of how we understand it, has to be reevaluated, both from the student's point of view, but also from the educators or instructors' point of view, because they are also very instrumental in this process. So if we back up, it says intelligence is not fixed at birth, that the quality of a child's educational experience during infancy and early childhood are substantially related to their measured intelligence, academic achievement, and pro-social behavior. We're looking at infancy, early childhood, talking about how do we engage their sensories. What's happening with touch, taste, smell, how are they being engaged? They need to touch a lot of things, feel a lot of things. They need to be exposed to different environments that's engaging them. In child development, they talk a lot about this. But I think where we lose momentum, so to speak, is that we stop engaging all of those different areas. It shouldn't stop at infancy or early childhood. It actually should be a part of education continuously. It shouldn't stop. It's like there's this overarching focus in the early years, and then it begins to dwindle as folks get older. But the most challenging group of people to work with, according to people in the community, are whom? Older folks. A lot of the younger folks, they have a lot of attention, a lot of programs, but it's the older group that tends to have the less programs. It's almost like we say every program, all the energy, all the time that we gave in the early years should almost sustain them, but that's not true. The same energy, the same intent must continue. It must continue in a way that supports them in terms of future. We should be trying to figure out how to give tools so then people are able to use them themselves. When I think about the people that are most instrumental in an educational space, or for the learning space, or for the growth space, it's these people. Now, if we're talking about school, I think what's really important is that how a teacher perceives a student also begins to project the success of a student. If a teacher sees a student as having great potential, then they're going to set up the classroom in a way to promote that potential. They're going to figure out what type of curriculum is needed. How should the room be set up? What type of practices should the teacher have, or should the teacher allow students to have to feel ownership of that collective learning space? How much input do they have in terms of the direction of the class? What type of relationship does that instructor have with that student? What type of relationship does that teacher have with that child's parent, family members, guardians, so forth? That's the type of investment that's needed inside of a classroom. So when I think about instructors and their role, I know that it's primary because they have a great level of impact. Every instructor that I've known, the first thing that I appreciate the most is that they care. That they care. That they spend time actually getting to know that student, having a relationship with that student, knowing what is important to that student. Oftentimes, when that doesn't happen, some students become disengaged because they feel like they're just a number. They feel like they're just a body in that seat. But for me, around this awakening piece, If the young people were getting a level of attention and love at home, or if it was absent, it becomes even more important that in that classroom that the teacher have a level of thoughtfulness and a level of engagement around student success. I always tell teachers when I go into environments and I'm having these discussions around teacher preparation, I suggest to teachers, if you don't want to be heavily involved in a student life, you don't want to be a teacher. If you're coming to just disseminate curriculum or give a great lecture or, help somebody develop tools, it's not going to work. Now, all students don't learn the same. But I think when you talk about culture, typically a way of life of people, this includes values, norms, beliefs, customs, so forth. And you add ethnicity. Those two things makes it even more complex to understand in terms of how students need to learn. But if we take in consideration those things, then we're more thoughtful about what we should do in those spaces. So for me, it should be a team of people that's supporting this awakening process. There has to be somebody in the community. Almost all the young people that I've worked with know somebody in the community that supports them. It could be a coach, a family friend, the next door neighbor. These people have a level of investment too. Sometimes they're just echoing the sentiments of the parents. Sometimes they're offering different perspective. And we all know, because everybody in here has done it, your parents can tell you something and you don't hear it. Somebody else tell you something and you're like, oh yeah. And you tell your parent, they're like, I already told you that. And sometimes we hear things differently, right? So we need that community member, right? And I think that we also have to be mindful of who are our children's peers, which sometimes we can't control, but just being mindful of who are their peers. What is the school environment? How are the students treated in that school environment? One of my biggest critiques of Oakland schools, and I have a critique because I feel like if you have a critique, it's important that you want to just, for me, it's not just about speaking negatively, it's about wanting it to change. One of my largest critiques about Oakland schools is that they feel like prisons. Now, I've never been locked up before, but I've been to enough jails to give enough lectures and talks that it feels like a prison. And when you walk on, the gates are already closed. That's kind of problematic. And usually by the gates, there's like a correctional officer. So you gotta, even if there's not gates, even when you go to the front door of the school, there's an officer there. So it feels like you're walking into a place that's unsafe. That doesn't suggest learn. That makes me have to be mindful of my well-being. Learning should be a space where you feel free, carefree, where there's laughter and joy. But when you see a cop, we know that creates a heightened awareness for people of color, just because of the history around cops. That doesn't say friendly environment. That doesn't say come in. That doesn't say you're welcome. So that piece is important to be mindful of. That's a critique. The other piece is that sometimes the environment just doesn't feel like it's a fun environment in the sense of there's concrete everywhere, there's no grass. Some of the schools are starting to put up murals now to kind of engage the color, but some of them, they feel very dry, just based on aesthetics. The feeling of any place also suggests how you want to be there, do you want to be there? And so being mindful of these people, all of these people not just play a role in terms of how they engage the young person, but also how are they contributing to their environment? What's their role? And so when I think of these things, I'm always wanting to push people to think about, in whatever role they want to be, what are they going to offer? What are they going to bring? What are they going to change? And I'm always just kind of mindful because I deal with a lot of young people, and the young people have a lot of the answers too. If you talk to them, they'll actually tell you, this is what we need. This is going to be helpful. So it's not like you have to go do some type of research. It's already there. But these people are instrumental. Going back, right? So this comes out of Dr. Amos Wilson's books. He says environmental actions is the engine which drives human development on all levels, including intelligence. Environmental interactions. Like, how are we engaging with our environment? This could be a physical space. This could be an actual relationship. But how are we engaging? And then of those engagements, how fulfilling are they? What are we getting? So environmental actions are important. This is why when I bring up safety, safety is relevant. Because it's about your comfort level. If people in here thought that I was going to rob them, people wouldn't be sitting here relaxed. You have your hands tucked in. You would be on guard, so to speak. Being on guard doesn't support learning. So making sure that you can have an engagement where it's fulfilling, that it's helpful, that it helps to shape who you are is important. Child development comes from environments as well as child's attempt to cope with the environment, right? So coping can be positive or negative. How are people coping with the circumstances? So if we have schools that are well-resourced, there might be less of a need to cope, but more of just an experience that is guided through research, or I'm sorry, not research, but like the environment. It's guided through what the practices are. Schools that are not so developed, you're engaging in a level of you're trying to cope with what's missing, what's absent, right? So that doesn't support what a student needs. This thing here says acting on things and people and their responses. So our responses are important. How do we respond? So in the environment piece is important, but it's the people in the environment as well. So those three that I've identified, whether it's the people, whether it's the environment, those two, as they work coincide. They support each other in terms of awakening the intelligence, awakening the capacity. All students have the same capacity, but what is there supports them being prepared for what's next. When we talk about survival, we have to know, what do people need to engage in this society? This is why when students come to Merritt, I'm always very mindful that one of our most difficult jobs is trying to figure out how to teach to the whole group, because everybody has different levels of engagement with environments. Some people have experienced school environments that have been well-resourced, well-funded, and have consistent instruction at the highest level. And that's prepared them in terms of growing their skills. So then when they come here, they have a level of ability to do what? Think critically. Have an analysis. Study at the highest level. Read and retain at the highest level. Because they've had environments that have helped develop them. Well, when students are in environments where they haven't been developed, it doesn't mean they don't have the capacity. It means that now there must be a different level of engagement to do what? Support capacity building. And that's a very hard task when you when you have a group of people and they're at different places. So in terms of environment, I identified these pieces that are so important in terms of socialization, but also in terms of how people are understanding who they are. And so whether it's the home life, what is home like life? What are people getting at home? Is it loving? Is it nurturing? Is it consistent? Those things are important to be mindful of. If home aren't those things, then where does school come in? Where does that after school placement comes in? Or that recreational activity come in? In a perfect scenario, all of these things will be working in concert to support the growth of a child. That's the perfect scenario. But just based in social inequity, we know that this often isn't the reality. So if it isn't the reality, then we have to think about, in whatever place you're in, what role do you play? How do you make that environment a place that meets that child's needs? That's where the relationship that I mentioned earlier comes in, because you're not going to know where to engage someone, what to give them, without having a relationship to be able to understand what has been the history and what do they need. There's some ideal things, and then there's some realities. And so when I think about religion and spirituality, I'm always mindful that historically, amongst African people, it's played an instrumental role, historically. However, I would argue over the past 40 years, it's shifted. As the black church has shifted, so has its impact has shifted. I don't know if people will know. How many folks go to church here? A few people? Anybody been invited to a church? Cool. When you go to church, one of the things I notice is that, and this is my observation, and tell me if I'm wrong, but when it comes to black boys, around the age of like 14 till about 26 is gone. And then the ones that are like in their like 30s that are there, they're usually married to somebody in the church. And all the young girls, they're pretty much there. And I'm like, where are all the boys at? And that's concerning. Because for me, it doesn't mean you have to be religious or Christian. I'm just paying attention to historically, it's been a place to support that awakening process. It was a place where you receive nourishment. So if folks aren't there, then the question becomes, where is it happening? Is it happening? Those are questions that have to be explored. Now, in terms of the community historically played an instrumental role, because the community didn't mean a group of people that lived in the same geographic area. That's not what it meant. It meant that you have relationships with the people in that environment. I personally don't know my next door neighbors, none of them. Most people don't. That's a newer phenomenon. 40 years ago, you knew everybody that stayed in your environment. And that's how you also knew who to have a relationship with and who not to have a relationship with. There was a level of history that the parents and elders had. Why is that important? Because if everybody in the community knew each other, you was going to get in trouble, most definitely, because nothing you did wasn't going to be seen. But it also meant that you got a different level of attention, a different level of consistency. It meant that people were investing in that child, even when the parents weren't there. Even when you were a latchkey kid. Folks know what a latchkey kid is? Show of hands. Those are the kids that their parents had to work, and they came home, and they was watching TV until their parents came home. Or wasn't supposed to be watching TV, right? I was always told not to watch TV, but I did. My mother had a lot of tricks, too. She would, like, touch the back of the TV and was like, the TV was on. I was like, dang, okay, yep. But the latchkey kid was relevant because the community began to erode in a way where relationships weren't present. Kids now had to get engaged by the television. And now, it's not so much the television, it's more like social media platforms. Right? And so when I'm thinking of awakening, now we have to shift, so to speak. Because it's not just the people that's important, it's the content that's important to engage them. So we have to ensure that people are getting the appropriate content. So I'm always saying to parents and guardians, don't say you can't have, a Facebook account, or you can't go on this website. I'm always saying, figure out how do they use them as tools of learning. Because the moment you say you can't, they're going to. If you say they can't have a Facebook account, well, that's passe. Hold on. Facebook is old. Facebook is for like people my age. Most of the young people want like Snapchat, right? That's the thing. So if they don't have a Snapchat on their phone, that just means they're going to access a Snapchat on somebody else's phone. Right? So you have to figure out how to use these things in a very healthy way, right? For me, the classroom in relationship to the community can actually be a very robust learning experience. I think we need to ensure that our communities are creating a space for our schools to exist. I always tell principals that I'm working with that one of your primary jobs as a principal is to keep every student in class. So if I see people walking down the hallways, I think that's problematic. Everybody should be in class. Beyond that, you should figure out how do you make sure that the community feels invested in that school. That brother that's standing on the block, even though he's standing on the block, that he believes that those students should be in school and that he has a vested interest in those students being in school. That the parents in that community have a role at that school. That the elders in that community have a role at that school. Everybody in that community should feel invested in those schools. That supports the awakening process. When you know that the people that even are outside of the school want you in school, then you feel a different level of investment. Then you feel more connected to that we-ness that I uplifted earlier, that your educational journey is not just about you. I remember one time I was over at Casamont and I was teaching a class, and I'm always very mindful of like things that's happening around me, and I'm always wondering, are these things that I'm experiencing happen in other places? So I'm at Casamont teaching a dual enrollment course, and I'm lecturing, and all of a sudden we hear like this loud blaring of music drive by. So I had to stop. But and I'm thinking, wow, like, do other people have to deal with this? Like, why our kids have to deal with disruption like that? So then they came back. And then they came back. And then it stopped. And it was like right across the street, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. So I had a TN in class, and I was like, go outside and talk to the dude and tell him to turn on his music. So I went outside, and the dude turned on his music. And what he said was, the students, we're trying to finish this lecture, it's really important. You know what the dude said? He's like, I didn't know nobody was in school. No conflict. He was like, I didn't know. So what it says to me is that somebody in the community doesn't know the importance or doesn't even have an awareness of what's happening right there. We had no problems. The students were like, oh, he about to get into a fight. And I was like, no. And when they came back and he was like, there was no conflict, they was like, for real? Because there's an expectation that people aren't invested. So there's just getting people involved supports the awakening process, that everybody has a role. It's like when you go on a team, everybody has a role. It might be a small role, it might be a large role. Everybody has a role. So I'm always thinking about learning styles, like how do people learn? And our students need to get information in different ways. And typically, in school settings, usually our students are engaged through lecture. Like this. This is not good. Just making me very clear. Like if you do this, what I'm doing here with students in class for for an hour and 20 minutes, it's not good. It's not good. And if you engage in it with like dittos, or like, dittos is an old word. Nah, that's dating myself. They're like, ditto, what's that? Handouts. Handouts. If you're engaging with handouts, then it's problematic. And there's been all this research around the left and the right brain. And they said a lot of the research has pointed to most black students being right brain students. So then there's an automatic assumption that black students all learn one way. That's problematic. It's important that we know, okay, there's a large percentage of them that are right brain, and there's a way to engage them, but then to assume that there are no other variables that are important is harmful, right? The other piece is around like culture and how culture shows up. So if people have learned through art or learned through music, then it tends to be easier in terms of those modalities for them to learn. It doesn't mean they can't learn other ways, it just means that has become norm for them. So that is important to be mindful of. But I'm always saying that if we want to present information or address a topic, there's different ways to engage people, right? So as teachers, we have to figure out how do we use these in a strategic way to help students learn. So most people that have been in my class know that I never start off class just lecturing. There's always usually a video clip in the beginning or a prompt on the board in the beginning to begin to engage them. If the video is playing, it's the first thing is like, oh, and it's like they're tuned in, they're engaged. But it's intentional because whatever video clip is on, everybody knows it's going to connect to that lecture. But before we even get there, they write. So they watch or they see the prompt and then they write. And there's no right or wrong. They're just writing, they're just processing. For me, I'm trying to get all of their goodness out, all their brilliance out. Then from there, break into dyads. Talk to somebody next to you. Now, they're the experts about the topic and they're talking with each other. So there's some peer supportive learning, right? This is important because we don't use this tool enough inside of schools where students get to actually be experts. They get to use their knowledge base instead of just being kind of deposited into like empty vessels. That's how some of us teachers teach. Like, well, y'all know nothing. Y'all just gonna come in and we're gonna give you all of this information and then you're gonna go out into the world and do great things. That's not how it happens. Goes back to a banking concept. You know, so it's important that we kind of be mindful of this process. I think oral, pictures, fine art, there's so many ways to use different presentation styles to engage students in student learning. And so for me, I think it's important that we begin to diversify our teaching methods because then this supports auditory learners, visual learners, kinesthetic learners. But this requires what? You getting to know your students, because how do you know who has what learning style if you haven't done the proper research, so to speak? This is called the CLEAR framework. The CLEAR framework is a way that has been used in some schools in the state of New York around engaging students. So the CLEAR is basically culturally relevant pedagogy. So for students of African ancestry, it's been known as African-centered pedagogy, but really it's curriculum that reflects the African experience, historically and in modern day. And I think if I am to make an assessment, I think this is where some places, including churches and schools, have lost our students. If you're not speaking directly to someone's experience and giving them tools in those places to address their specific experience, then how is it relevant? It's not. It's not. 50 years ago in a black church, they always talked about black people experiencing racism. You could not go to church and not hear about that. Now people are often talking about the Christian experience. It's not a knock on Christianity, it's just an assessment about how the church has evolved in our communities. It's important to be mindful of schools. A lot of schools are not speaking to the unique experiences of black boys and black girls. Black boys and black girls have a unique experience in society. If we're not talking about that experience, then it's not reflective of their everyday life. You can't create this false environment and then find relevance or importance in if it's not actually speaking to them. So that means you have to be invested. That means you have to kind of explore what is happening in those communities, what's happening in those environments, and bring that into the classroom. Bring it into the classroom as an opportunity to create a learning space so when folks are going out, like I spoke of before, and able to utilize it. Listening to students' voices deeply and meaningfully. This is what helps to awaken that process as well. Are we listening to our students? Are parents listening to their children? And I don't mean listen to respond. And as parents and as teachers, sometimes we have to be mindful of our facial expressions. Our children want to come talk to us, but they look at your face and they're like, oh, that wasn't good. I shouldn't have said that. I'm not going to tell them nothing else. Because they see it all over your face. And even though you might not, you think it's something, but you ain't said it, everything you're thinking is on your face. Right? And so sometimes it's reassuring, like, I'm going to have my experience. You going to share. No, there's no judgment. I'm just human too. I'm having the experience. But that listen is important because we begin to learn more about our young people when we listen. Their needs, their aspirations. They get to explore even through their sharing, they get to learn more about themselves. Because sometimes it's about them being able to just share out. Sometimes we hold so much stuff in, and then it's not until we say it, then we begin to have a different level of understanding. It says empower excellence continuously and consistently. What I would emphasize is the consistency. One of the things that's happening right now is just like black exceptionalism, as though like black students or black achievement or success is rare. And then when it happens, we like overly celebrate it. But black intelligence, black achievement, black success should be normalized. It doesn't mean we don't celebrate it, but we should create opportunities for them to experience success and then celebrate it. But there should be some consistency. So that means we have to be thoughtful about those opportunities. Then we get to the accessing, assessing, student thinking, knowledge, and understanding. It means we should be figuring out what are they learning. Because if we figure out what they're learning, then we know what to give them. This goes back to when I made the brief statement about the banking. When you don't listen, when you don't, gauge where students are at based on, what they have information to, then you continue to give them information that they might need or not need. But you do the assessment piece to figure out how do I continue to give you what is going to be helpful. And this last one is implementing routines, structures, and create learning environments conducive to academic, social, and emotional success. Right? Trying to raise emotional maturity, which is helpful particularly for black boys because we live in a society still where it's not acceptable for black boys to show any other emotion than anger. Right? So we need to create a space where it's okay for you to emote, for you to learn different emotions, people to know that you're going to experience hundreds of emotions throughout the day, and you're going to move through them in a very healthy way, but you need to know what those things are. You need a practice space. So that's important. And then when we think about the routines help for ownership. When students or young people are able to be in an environment and they're connected to a routine, they have ownership of their learning, ownership of that space. That helps them to be engaged at a different level. And so as we think about what the CLEAR is offering, these are just ways and examples that are out there. People are thinking about this. This isn't a new topic. This isn't a new phenomenon. People have been talking about this for years on how do we begin to engage people at a different level to ensure success, not just in the classroom, but in people's homes, communities, and future endeavors.